first of all, I am in North Dakota. Have any of you been to North Dakota before?
No.
Oh, okay. That's usually what I get. I get a lot of that. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about what I do. My name is Pam Kukla, and I'm with the Theodore Roosevelt Center. And what we do is we collect everything related to Theodore Roosevelt. We collect everything that was written about him, everything that he wrote, everything that was written about him, everything that is imaginable. And we all have it online. So if you ever need anything about Theodore Roosevelt, you can go to our website. That's theodorerooseveltcenter.org, and we can help you. If you're on social media, you can follow us there. Whoa. Okay, there we go. And another thing, these are some of the items that we have in our library. We have over 50,000 items. We have everything from pictures of Theodore Roosevelt attending and looking at Abraham Lincoln's funeral procession. We have the map of Theodore Roosevelt going down the Rio, Brazil. We have actually in this corner down there, the statue is actually a life-size statue of Theodore Roosevelt made in butter. So if you ever need a picture of Theodore Roosevelt made in butter, we've got it on our site. Something good to know. So let's get started a little bit. This is about Theodore Roosevelt and how he became a modern president and how his legacy has continued. Things that you might not know about Theodore Roosevelt is that he was called a trust buster, which meant that he broke up monopolies. The railroad had a monopoly and he stepped in and broke it up. He was also settled strikes. And raise your hand if you have ever been in a national park. None of you have never been to a national park? One. You've never gone to a national, just one of you's been to a national park? Okay, well, he started the national park system. He used the Antiquities Act to get that started. He also, have you ever been or heard a president on TV? Raise your hand. None of you have ever heard a president or seen a newspaper article with the president ever? I think you have. Well, Theodore Roosevelt was the one that started all of that. He started meeting with the newspapers and journalists, and he was the first president to do that. He actually started a press room for journalists. He also was the first president to ever travel outside of the United States while he was president. All the rest of them just stayed where they were. He also campaigned. Up until this point, all the presidents used to sit literally on their front porch of their house, and everybody went to them. Theodore Roosevelt was the first person to actually travel around to see the people that he was trying to get to vote for him. It was called husking. Another thing that he did was civil service reform. Have any of you, raise your hand, and I'm expecting some comments here. Raise your hands if you've ever been to a post office. None of you have ever been to a post office. Ever, ever, ever. Okay, thank you. Well, he started civil service reform by making sure you used to be able to get a job in the civil service by who you knew, by who you were friends with. And Theodore Roosevelt instead made people take a test to see if they were any good at what they did before they got a job. Kind of a new idea, believe it or not, at the time. The other thing that he did was that he made a viable third-party political system when he ran for a third time. Now, the slide that, can you guys all see the slide that I have up that's called executive power? Executive power is granted to the President of the United States by the Constitution. It states in Article 2 of the Constitution, it gives the title of Commander-in-Chief to the President of the United States, and it requires that the President shall take care that the laws are faithfully executed, so that any laws in the United States that come to be, he makes sure that they are taken care of, that they are executed. And there's something else, and this is what is going to set us up for the coal strike that we're going to talk about. Theodore Roosevelt, the presidents before him, believed that powers that were not specifically given to them were forbidden. Theodore Roosevelt, on the other hand, believed that powers not forbidden were his. So if you were told not to do something, you couldn't do it. But if somebody told you no laws against it, you could do it. So if, for example, and this is a really silly example, but if somebody said to the president, you have to sit down all the time, he would sit down. But he would also stand because nothing in the law said that he couldn't stand. So he really expanded on those powers. Unless he was specifically told he couldn't do something, he did it. The Pelicans refuge in Louisiana, the birds were being just totally wiped out because everybody was using their feathers to make hats. And he wanted to make a refuge to protect all of those birds. And he met with his advisors, and the advisors, he said, I want to make this refuge. And the advisor says, well, you can't do that. And he said, well, is there anything that says I can't do this? And they said no. So he made a bird refuge to protect all the birds. So that's how Theodore Roosevelt thought about executive powers. Unless he was actually told not to do something, he did it. And this is how he worked with the anthracite coal strike. How many of you know what the word bully means? Raise your hand if you've ever heard the word bully before. Okay, we've heard it. Now, Theodore Roosevelt had what he called the bully pulpit. And bully meant something completely different than what it does now. Bully actually meant something was great, that it was wonderful, completely different meaning than we have now. And the bully pulpit was what he called his presidency. He believed that as president, you could raise topics to be discussed, that the president was limited in his powers because Congress makes the laws. But if the president's talking about something, the nation is talking about something. You're too young to know this, but a long time ago, Ronald Reagan loved jelly beans. And it seems kind of silly, but he loved jelly beans. He had jelly beans all over the place. And because he loved jelly beans, the nation talked about jelly beans. And that's what happens. If the president's talking about it, everybody's talking about it. And that's what President Theodore Roosevelt did. He brought up topics to be discussed. And when he discussed them, then everyone in the United States started discussing them too. And that's what he used and what he meant by the bully pulpit. Another thing to keep in mind is the times were really changing during this period. You're going into a lot of big industry. You had a lot of big governments, and the businesses and the government didn't do anything with them. You could create a business and do whatever you wanted, and the government really didn't say anything to you. They didn't interfere or anything. And Theodore Roosevelt had a problem with that. He believed that the government had a right and they had a responsibility, not just a desire, they had a responsibility to regulate big businesses so that there was no negative effects on the people. And that had not been discussed or heard of before. So he stepped in and started to decide that the government needed to step in to make sure that there were no negative effects on the people. Here's some pictures of Theodore Roosevelt on his bully pulpit. Now, if you ever get a chance, you are going to hear what he sounds like. And if you look at Theodore Roosevelt, he's a really loud guy. And his voice was actually really high. It was kind of nasally. And when you look at these pictures, do you see any speakers or microphones? Are there any microphones standing there in front of him? No. This man sat there and he gave speeches to thousands and thousands of people without a single microphone. He had to be that loud. And if you look at that center picture, right where it says the bully pulpit, he used to stand on top of anything he could find to talk. And in this case, he's standing on top of a table and on this crowd so people could see him when he gave his speech. He was known to stand on chairs. He was on the back of a lot of trains. His speeches were then copied and given out in newspapers so people could understand what they said because they couldn't hear him all the time. But very, very loud speaker, very, 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 very loud speaker. Anthracite. Raise your hands if you know what anthracite is. I'm not surprised because I just learned what anthracite is. Anthracite is a type of coal, and anthracite coal was really needed because it was a hard coal and it burned really, really hot and it left very little ashes. So everybody wanted anthracite coal. So when we talk about the anthracite coal strike, anthracite is talking about the type of coal it is. Now, if you could unmute yourself, I know we're getting some feedback, but do any of you know anything about coal mining? Oh, okay, maybe we'll just, yeah, that's just, we're getting way too much feedback. Okay. The coal mining that they did in Pennsylvania, sometimes you have strip mining where you take away the dirt. And then you have where you have shafts that you have to go into, you have to blow things up and you have to dig the shafts. That's the kind of mining that they did. And it was very, very, very dangerous. So the anthracite coal strike, we have very, very dangerous jobs. And then we have some changes in the labor. When President McKinley was president, and if you look at the numbers on that slide, there were 447,000 labor unions. Not a pretty good number, but we're talking about the entire United States. When Theodore Roosevelt became president 4 years later, after McKinley's assassination, there were 1,125,000 labor unions. It exploded. Labor unions were everywhere. And they went from having very few stoppages or strikes to having over 3,000 in just 4 years. The labor unions just exploded. They had them all over the place. And what caused this, so with the strike, you had all these labor unions, and then you have the mine owners. And the mine owners didn't like the labor unions at all. They weren't fond of them. And that's putting it pretty mildly. They did not like them. And they didn't like working with them. A previous smaller strike had been forced on them, and they had to make concessions with the labor unions. And they had decided amongst themselves that they would never back down or make concessions to a labor union again. So when this labor strike happened, they were set against. Their heels were dug in, and they weren't going to make any concessions to these strikers at all. And if you see in that corner, it's kind of a hard cartoon to see, but one of the mine owners declared divine right. And raise your hands. Have any of you heard of divine right? Divine right means that you are given powers by God to rule other people. Pretty lofty statement. And these mine owners made this statement. The rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for not by the labor agitators, but by the Christian men to whom God, in his infinite wisdom, has given control of the property interest of the country. So the mine owners are saying that God gave them the right to determine how to treat the labor unions and the workers. That did not go very well at all. People really had outrage and did not approve of what the mine owners said. You guys are in, raise your hand, are you in the 5th grade? 6th grade? You're 20 years old. Raise your fingers up. How old are you guys? 10, 12, you're 3. Well, what I'm trying to do is tell you something about the mine owner, the kids that work in the mine. The kids that worked in the mine were 9 years or younger. So are you guys, raise your hands if you're older than the early mine workers. Okay, so we're older than the mine workers. Okay.
Our students today are 7th to 12th grade.
Okay, good. I was told I had a 5th grade class. So what we have then is you have miners that are working, literally that are miners. They are 9 years old or younger. And they're called breaker boys. They would sit, and if you look on the corner, they would sit over a conveyor belt, and they would go through the rocks and the coal that was coming through, and they would pick out the rocks and throw them away, and you just have coal. They would work for 50 to 75 cents a day and work a shift of 10 to 12 hours and only get 50 cents a day for a 12-hour shift. They would work in horrific conditions where it was super hot, very, very cold, a lot of coal dust. And if you can see the pictures, it's a dirty profession. And they would never get up from those spots. They would like eat their lunches right there. So that everything was covered in coal dust. And this is the younger of the miners that worked. Now, the older miners, the ones that were had more training, maybe the ones that used the explosives to build the mine shafts, or maybe the ones that actually used the picks to get the coal out, or maybe the ones that drove the carts. They worked for $1.35 a day, maybe $1.65 a day. And they would still be working those 10 to 12-hour shifts. So again, we're not talking about an hourly wage. We're talking about a daily wage. Their annual take-home pay was only about $734 a year. They didn't work every single day because sometimes they only averaged about 300 days a year because there were cave-ins, there were explosions. They had to wait for their shafts that went down in there. They had to wait for those to be made. So they only worked 300 days out of a year, maybe. They had very little chance, if any, life insurance because the job was so incredibly dangerous. And if you look at the statistics on there, in 30 years, over 10,000 men and boys were killed, and 25,000 of them were either seriously injured and had some type of job-related damage to themselves, maybe because of explosions, maybe of cave-ins. Also, there was a lot of gas built up in the mine shafts.
Pam, I have a question from our students.
Oh, yes.
Why did the kids start working in the mines at such a young age?
They needed to. what would happen, and I have some accounts of these mine workers, is that the pay was so low that they needed the children, and actually the parents would lie because they were only supposed to be working when they were 13, but the parents would lie about their ages because they needed that money to support themselves. They would live in mine houses. They had to go to the grocery stores that the mine owners owned, and they needed the money to survive. So they would take their children out of school as young as 9 and sometimes even younger and put them to work. It was a very hard life. Yeah, so very little schooling, if any. Now, you would think with all of these harsh conditions that people would like the labor unions, but they didn't. Not everyone approved of the labor unions. And these cartoons show some of that. In almost all of these images, you have Lady Justice or you have Liberty, Law and Order, and they show how these labor unions really did involve a lot of violence. When somebody was a strike breaker, they tried to cross the lines that they were striking. There was violence directed towards them. They were beaten. Some of them were murdered, lynched. There were, and Cripple Creek in Colorado, after this strike, there was incredible violence. They blew up mines. There was a former governor in Idaho that was assassinated by one of the labor unions. So there were a lot of people that were against the labor unions. Even though they did try to do better things, they were also had the reputation of being very violent. So the anthracite coal strike, what they wanted was, surprise, they wanted more money. They wanted more than $1.30 an hour or a day, and they wanted shorter days. And they wanted also mediation so that if they had a problem, instead of being just told that they had no say in the matter, they had a chance to try to arbitrate, try to come up with a solution. So on May 12th, the mine owners said that they would not work with them. So John Mitchell, who was president of the United Mine Workers of America, called the strike. So on May 12th, and remember this, May 12th, 1902, 147 mine workers walked off of the job. And there's John Mitchell's picture there. And this is what happens. The mine workers go off. So the mine owners said, fine, we'll bring in strike breakers. We're going to bring other people in because this is such a great job. We'll bring other people in. Well, unbeknownst to them, the immigrants that they brought in decided to side with the unions, and they went on strike also. And this is also a case where they started bringing in younger and younger children to work in the mines too. Your death rates, your accidents started going up as well. The price of coal skyrocketed. Here in North Dakota, I am currently paying $3.59 for a gallon of gas. The cost equivalent to the coal was being paid would be equivalent to me paying $12.93 for a gallon of gas. The coal was so incredibly high, people weren't able to buy it. They were going into winter. Schools were closing because they couldn't keep them warm, and it was becoming violent. 7 people actually died in the violence with the mobs, and there was, like I said, increasingly more and more accounts of violence. And Theodore Roosevelt was afraid that if something wasn't done, there would be more deaths, either because of people freezing to death or more violence between the mobs, between the labor unions and the strike breakers. And he felt that it was becoming dangerous and he needed to intervene. So this is what Theodore Roosevelt decided to do. He decided that he was going to intervene. Now, everybody told him that he shouldn't, that he had no legal right. But remember what Theodore Roosevelt thought about his executive powers? He was told that he shouldn't, but there were no laws saying that he couldn't intervene. Remember his description of executive powers. So he started to intervene. He also realized that the union and the mine owners, they weren't going to work together. Somebody was going to have to step in. Theodore Roosevelt would also later on step in to a war and win a Nobel Peace Prize for being able to step in and settle disputes. And he also feared that it would become a national crisis. He said that he feared that with the soaring coal prices, riots would develop and there would be social unrest in the cities. And he feared for the people. He feared for the masses. So the first thing he did was that he wanted facts. He didn't just want what the unions thought, and he didn't want just the side of what the mine owners thought. He wanted the facts. He wanted the truth. So he had his labor commissioner, Carol R.D. Wright, go and investigate. Hello? So they had, do you have a question? Nope. Okay. So he decided to get the facts together with the commissioner. And the commissioner came back and decided to give the facts to the people. He also discussed bringing in the troops to use the coal if they needed to. And he created the Anthracite Coal Strike Commission. This picture is the Anthracite Coal Strike Commission. And what it is a group of people that came together. The labor union would talk to these men. The mine owners would talk to these men, but they didn't have to talk to each other. And this is what settled the differences. So the members were made up of an officer of the engineering corps, an expert mining engineer, a judge from that area, and a man who was, by active participation in mining and selling coal, is familiar with the physical and commercial features of the business. So somebody who knew the coal mining business. And all of these men so far had something to do with the coal mine owners. And the labor unions wanted someone on their side. So Theodore Roosevelt came up with this idea. His person on it was a man of prominence, an eminent sociologist. And he also convinced them to include a Catholic priest because the majority of the mine workers were Catholics. So this sociologist, how did he get a sociologist on there? What he did was he got actually a labor union, the head of the railway labor union, and he said, you know what? This guy's a sociologist. And everybody believed him. Theodore Roosevelt would later remark that Clark didn't probably even know what a sociologist was. But he was included, and the labor union, they had a voice. J.P. Morgan helped. He is a rich industrialist. He would later on become kind of at a problem with Theodore Roosevelt. They were not friends later on. But he met with the Secretary of War, and they forced the mine owners to listen to Theodore Roosevelt and listen to the commission. The public was getting upset with the mine owners, and they decided that they really needed to come to some kind of agreement. So they went out on a yacht because, and if you see in that cartoon, everybody followed J.P. Morgan everywhere he went, and they wanted this to be a secret meeting. So they got on a yacht, went out into the middle of a big lake, and they had their meeting because then no journalist, nobody could eavesdrop on them, and they're in the middle of a lake in the middle of a boat. And this was a yacht. It really was a pretty big boat. And they decided, and they forced the mine owners and the labor to sit down and listen to the commission. The miners returned to work on October 23rd, so they were on strike for 163 days. So from May until October, there was no coal that was mined. They went back to work and they said they would work until the commission came up with the findings. So that board of men that I showed you earlier, this is what they did. First of all, they toured the mining areas. They saw for themselves the working conditions that the people worked in. They saw the boardrooms. They saw the profit statements. They got the facts. Then they met for 3 months and they called 558 witnesses. They gathered up over 10,000 documents. They even had the famous attorney Clarence Darrow speak up for the miners. And they came up with a decision that J.P. Morgan forced them to understand and to follow through. That decision was that they would get a raise. They got a 10% raise. They'd asked for 20, but they were happy with the 10%. They also settled for a 9-hour workday. They had wanted 8, they settled for 9. They didn't get their labor union recognized, but they did get an arbitration board. So if there was an issue with something on the job, they could settle their differences. They could sit down, 3 men from the owners, and then they could try to settle their differences so they wouldn't end up in another strike. Another part of the commission was that no matter what, they had to abide by these findings for 3 years. So this commission's findings were binding for 3 years. This had lasting impact on not only the presidency, but also the United States. For the first time, the masses, the men, the laborers, were seen as having the same, if not equal, political power as the management. That had never been done before. And of course, that gave more power to the unions. It also began the policy of Theodore Roosevelt's square deal. And what he believed in a square deal was that everyone should be treated equally and fairly by the government. And it also was the precedent of the White House and the government and the president stepping in during a domestic crisis, that no one should be left to hang out and dry, that the businesses, they needed to listen to the people. Oh, sorry. One other thing that I kind of went one of my slides too fast. One thing about this legacy that continues on is, I'm sure you've heard of the Highway Department, the State Highway Patrol. They came out of this legacy. There was a coal and iron police force that was created, and that became our state patrol system because of this. We also ended up from this, the Progressive Party, which is still discussed today and would become the basis for Theodore Roosevelt's election campaign in his third term, or his attempt at a third term. And it also began to limit the power of the wealthy, the 400 as they were called. And it also began with...
Why were they called the 400?
It was, the 400 were called, they were the 400 most wealthy in, basically in New York. And they had the most political power, and they had all the money, and they controlled everything. If you wanted to do a lookup or anything like that, they were called the 400, and it was J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, these powerful, powerful men and women. But yeah, they were called the 400.
Thank you.
You're welcome. If you've ever looked at the Food and Drug Act, this is also a spinoff of this. Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, had a lot to do with it too, but this is a spinoff of it, and also the suffrage movement for women's right to vote. So, do you have questions for me?
So you guys have no questions. All right, when you say spinoff, I'll ask you questions.
Okay.
All right, when you say spinoff of the Food and Drug Act and the women's right to vote, what you're saying, okay, so Theodore Roosevelt was president, and in that time, he did so much to help people be able to have a fair government, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so when you say, and I know because I have two young ladies here that talks about women and women's roles in history,
Mhm.
and when you say the women's right to vote, is that something that is going to happen after Theodore Roosevelt's presidency?
Yes, it's going to happen afterwards. He was friends with Jane Addams and in the suffrage movement, especially during the Progressive Party, but it doesn't come into play until Woodrow Wilson and even later on than that. But he was known of supporting the suffrage movement, but it doesn't come into play till much later.
And what about the laws on the labor laws for children? You talked a lot about the coal mines and the age of the children who work the coal mines. When were the child labor laws created? Do you know?
That I'm not sure of the specific dates, but unfortunately that goes much after his presidency also.
Okay.
When you looked at the Industrial Revolution, it is just starting to be addressed. The Industrial Revolution is just starting during his time, his presidency. So they just started becoming aware of the harshness of it and all of the problems with it, and they started addressing them later on after his presidency.
How were the children addressed when the unions came together with the management? Was that addressed at all?
Yes, actually, if you've ever heard of the woman Mother Jones, they did they worked in the mills. They actually went on strike too. Just the children themselves later on would actually go on strike during Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. So they would even strike on their own.
And what was his response to that?
He, that particular one, he wasn't too involved with because it actually started really large and kind of fizzled out by the time it got to him. He was, when he was police commissioner, he met with Jacob Riis, and he really started to see how the other half lived. And that really changed his idea of what needed to be done for the lower classes and for children. He would donate not only money, but his time. His parents were very involved in helping, the underclass, because I mean, he was from a very wealthy family, but he still donated time and money towards that organization and towards various organizations like that.
Got a question? Any of you guys have questions? I figured out a lot of things I was interested in and that I could go and explore. So I'm sure that all of you have at least one question in your head from these notes that you can ask and explore about. You have an expert here.
How many children worked in the mine? Or
How many children?
Yeah.
I would say because like when you look at the numbers, so when they said that 10,000 men and boys had been killed in the mines, you're looking at, I would say probably about a third, because in the mines you had children that did the breakers, so they went through all the rocks, but then you also had boys that would work and direct the airflow in the mines. They would also be the ones that would take care of the mules and the horses. So any position that did not take like physical labor, like breaking the rocks down, that were taken care of by children because they didn't take as much training, and it was a lot cheaper to pay a young child 50 cents a day to sit next to a gate than it was to pay an adult male $1.30 an hour or a day to do the same job. So I said, I'm not sure of the exact numbers, but I think you could easily say at least a third of the employees would have been underage children, easily.
And that meaning both boys and girls?
In the mines, you didn't have as many girls. In the factories, you would have boys and girls. In the mines, it was pretty much limited to boys.
Any more questions? You said J.P. Morgan was close with Theodore Roosevelt, and then later he wasn't. Why was that?
Because J.P. Morgan wanted big business, and he didn't want any interference from the government. And Theodore Roosevelt didn't believe that the government shouldn't be able to interfere or regulate government or big businesses. One of the things, like with the railroads, companies would own the railroads. They would own all the companies that would ship on the railroads, so they would have unfair advantages. And Theodore Roosevelt didn't think that was right for small businesses. And so he started busting those up, and JP Morgan did not like that. Rockefeller didn't either, but the 400 did not like that. And later on, when he started doing his trust busting, his different monopolies, breaking those up, they would become adversaries, very strong adversaries.
Okay, we have another question. What's your question?
Did it matter what type of race they had when working in the mines, or was it anybody?
What was that?
She wants to know if people of all races worked in the mines, or were there specific races? How
In
did
the
that work?
in the Pennsylvania mines, you're going to have the majority are going to be Irish Catholic, actually. In the Pennsylvania mines, you didn't have many different minorities working in the mines. And one reason for that was that you had a lot of very tough immigration laws at this point. A lot of immigration laws that were keeping people, different ethnicities coming in. But at least anyway, in the coal regions, the majority of people were Irish Catholics. Heavily part of that. When they did try to bring in the immigrants, they had a lot of European immigrants that were trying to do that.
What happened when they tried to do that?
In the earlier when they tried to break in, they were beaten up. But with the anthracite coal strike, what happened, and which really surprised the mine owners, they joined with the labor unions. They supported them, which surprised both the labor unions and surprised the mine owners. They expected them to just continue on with working, and they didn't. They went with the labor unions, and that's what caused the numbers to skyrocket with the labor unions.
I think they're all questioned out.
Well, if you have any other questions, you can sure go to our website. You can email us, follow us, and if something else comes up, you sure let me know, and I can continue to answer questions for you.
Oh, you know what? I do have a question. We've heavily been studying World War I and World War II. Are there any things that Roosevelt did during his presidency that affected World War I?
Theodore Roosevelt was very, very, very heavily involved in World War I. He, all of his children were involved in World War I. Actually, his daughter, before the United States became involved in World War I, went over and was a nurse. He spoke out against Wilson. He called him some very bad names. Called him lily-livered. He wanted the United States to get involved in World War I earlier. He tried to gather up a civilian Rough Rider Corps to get involved into World War I. He lost a son in World War I, and he wrote numerous books and pamphlets on how the United States, their best defense was to be prepared before World War I, and then we wouldn't have been involved in it. He broke ties with Jane Addams and a lot of people because he considered them pacifist and that they weren't supporting World War I. We have quite a few documents about World War I with President Roosevelt. Quite a few.
Thank you. That was such a great connection for them. I appreciate it.
Okay. Like I said, if you have any other questions, just please let me know.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it and enjoyed it.